All right, so a consumer duty. So as we've just heard, a consumer duty places a obligation on energy providers to act to promote good outcomes for consumers, as opposed to consumers being responsible to exercise choice to select and manage the products and services that are best for them. Why do we need this change in approach? And it's a change that's being seen across different jurisdictions and different regulatory sites. Why do we need it? Well, you've already heard about it and you're going to hear more about it. The world is becoming faster and more complex. Technology is moving quickly. New products, services are coming out day by day. Consumers themselves have less time. They're working longer hours. They've got more things they have to manage in their lives. They're under more pressure to choose cost-effective products, make ends meet, make decisions day to day, read material, balance budgets, and so on. But those issues also apply to the providers of the services. So if you're an energy provider or providing products or services in the energy market, things are getting faster and more complex for you as well. And one of the aims of a consumer duty is both to ease the burden for consumers, but also lift some of the regulatory compliance cost from providers by moving away from a prescriptive rule regime to an outcome-focused obligation. Let's have a look at that. What is outcome-based regulation, which is the term that's usually used to describe this proactive, positive duty to act in the interests of consumers? Well, it's got a greater focus on outcomes, good outcomes for consumers, and less emphasis on prescriptive rules. Doesn't mean rules disappear from the system, but it means that there's more of an obligation on what is the outcome that we want rather than how do we write that down and try and keep up with the market and comply with it and so on. So we move from rules about how parties have to behave, we move away from providing information, relying on providing information to consumers to let them look after their interests. We keep conduct obligations, don't mislead people, for example, but there's a greater focus, as I've said, on outcomes. Where else do we see outcome-based regulation? Well, actually, we're seeing it all over the place. It's the new thing in consumer protection and regulatory theory. So, we have a best interest duty in Corporations Act and the Credit Acts, which is actually a narrower duty than it perhaps sounds. It's primarily a duty to avoid conflicts of interest by those providing financial advice. We have the payment difficulty framework, which you'll all be familiar with, which is an obligation to act fairly once those obligations are triggered. Most of you will know that we're very worried about the online space, and in addition to banning children accessing certain social media, there's a discussion of a new duty of care on digital platforms and social media, which is a duty to use reasonable efforts to avoid foreseeable risk online. So harms to children, harms to young people, harms in terms of violent terrorist activity and so on. In the financial services market, which was mentioned, we have a design and distribution obligation, which requires providers of financial services, when they are designing products, to think about who is the audience, how is the product suitable for them, and ensure the product is only sold to that target market. And to go back and check that that's working, that it is being sold to the right people and it is working for those people. We have kind of new obligation in Corporations Act and the Credit Acts, which is called the obligation to act in a way, it's a licensing obligation, and parties who are providing financial services are subject to a licensing obligation to conduct their businesses in a way that is efficient, honest and fair. So again, it's this idea of achieving outcomes, positive conduct obligations, rather than prescriptive rules about how to behave or simply negative obligations. I say that's to be confirmed because that's quite a new duty and we're still waiting to see how that works. And I think the regulator will probably say more about that. And finally, in the UK financial services system has a consumer duty, which is a duty to promote good outcomes for consumers. It's a really broad outcome-based duty. And there's some interest in the energy regulator adopting a similar framework. So how does that work? How does this idea of outcomes or principles-based regulation work? Well, I guess it's not simply a situation where we say achieve a goal and off you go, and nor is it a removal of responsibility from consumers to exercise autonomy and choice. What it really is saying, here's our aspirations that we want the conduct of the participants in the market to reach. Here's some principles guiding how they will achieve those outcomes. Act fairly, act in good faith, don't mislead people. Here's some supporting outcomes, which I'll come to in a minute. Make sure pricing is fair, make sure products are suitable, have dispute resolution that's timely and effective. There's a regulatory guidance, so the regulator has a role in providing guidance to the market about their expectations about how this consumer outcome is reached. Regulators provide guidance. Providers of services have to use reasonable efforts to achieve the outcomes, but it's up to them largely about how they achieve those outcomes. They can do that in the way most suitable for the service they're providing, the market they're working in. But they're not left to their own devices. Providers of services have reporting obligations, and those reporting obligations are, what are you trying to achieve and how are you achieving it? How are you measuring that? What data do you have? How do you know you're reaching the outcomes you've specified? I'm going to add here that sandboxes are quite useful here, giving people an opportunity to experiment, to develop new metrics, and the principles are then refined in the light of those evidence-based outcomes. So, what are the possible outcomes we'd want energy providers to deliver under this sort of consumer duty? The slide you see now is a combination of the ideal outcomes that you see around the wall from the energy consumers, and also the possible outcomes that were identified by the Australian Energy Regulator in its report on this matter. So you can see aspirations of consumers receiving energy services in hardship, contracts meeting needs, consumers getting key information, providers explaining implications of new ways of doing business, new strategies, and consumers having access to free, timely dispute resolution. So those are the outcomes that might sit under this idea of a consumer duty. The point is, and I'll emphasise this again, a consumer duty would allow providers of services and products to decide how they achieve these outcomes, but would ask for metrics about how they're being achieved. So, for example, if one of the obligations is that consumers should be provided with key information to help them make their choices that they want, one of the things we might ask is, well, how do you know that that information is useful for consumers? Have you, the provider, done comprehension testing to see if people actually understand the information that's being provided? If we say that consumers should have access to free, timely, fair dispute resolution, what are the waiting times for internal dispute resolution? What percentage of disputes are resolved? And contracts and services should meet consumer needs. That's kind of that design and distribution obligation I mentioned earlier. How are the products designed to meet consumer needs? What consumers are they suitable for? Are we sure that they're reaching those consumers? Are there consumers that are left out? And how do we identify consumers for whom particular products and services are not suitable? So, aspirations, outcomes, guidance, measurement is really at the heart of the consumer duty. More responsibility to act in the interests of consumers on providers, but less technical rules, and for consumers, measurable outcomes that are to be reached rather than a reliance on information and negative prohibitions. That's the consumer duty.
Thank you, Jeannie. Very much appreciated. Well, I hope that's all clear now. It's a big change. So I'm going to break the cardinal rule here, and I'll kick off with Claire, and I'll quote you to you. Is that okay? From a letter that accompanied publicly, it's on your website. No. The AER really kicked off this conversation in a really compelling way, and I think in a brave way, and issued a report in November 2023 on consumer protection, which is on your website, which really investigated these opportunities. And one of the things that you said in the letter on top, I found quite compelling. And I'll just quote here: following rigorous risk analysis, research and extensive stakeholder consultation, the AER has found that the existing consumer protections arrangements set out under the National Energy Customer Framework are not fit for purpose for the future energy market, and that unless there's reform, consumers may lack the confidence to support the energy transition. Now, that's a pretty compelling call for change. I guess, Claire, we're all really keen to hear just a snapshot of your conclusions when you investigated this. Obviously, a lot of the work was in the context of new energy services, but you also dealt with traditional energy services. So perhaps you might outline the AER's thinking on this and what you learned through the course of your review.
Sure, okay. So I think, look, it's probably important to just give a bit of context as to how we got there. And I should say I did not start in a place personally where I thought that an overarching duty would necessarily work in energy. So some of my colleagues on our board had a different view to me. And so it was a real journey, a personal journey for me through the work that we did. But our entry point was really we were looking at the emerging new services for like energy services, and the idea that we'll have potentially people who might be aggregating energy within the home or selling it on your behalf. You might have child meters, more complicated sets of arrangements. And what we could see was that with the current framework, the definition of the sale of energy under the law is actually the sale of energy to the customer for the premises. So it's very much a one-way relationship, and then everything kind of flows from that. And so all the rules and the prescription and the regulations and our guidelines all kind of stem from that initial sale of energy to the customer for the premises. And so if you have a customer relationship that is not about selling energy to the customer for the premises, and so we see this quite often with when energy is embedded, for example, in hot water or cold water in apartment complexes. It's not necessarily captured by that legal definition. And so we were starting to think about what does that mean then for how we would protect consumers in this transitioning market, particularly if you're getting one bill and your bill might include things that are about the sale of energy, and some of it might be about the use of solar or the exporting of solar, et cetera, et cetera. And so we kind of then thought, but we also know that and all those 12,000 obligations don't all apply to retailers, that's across the entire system, but there certainly are a lot of very prescriptive rules in the energy system for energy retailers, and our concern was if you immediately tried to apply all of those to the sort of new entrants and the innovators, they would be crushed before they began, right? And so we started to say, okay, so how do you think about this problem? Because we've sort of people use this analogy all the time in the context of energy, but fix the plane while flying it. And so we've got a set of traditional participants who are providing services to customers today that need to continue to do that, and they need to do it in a predictable way and obviously within the current context. But how would you think about both? And I think we started to think about the overarching duty in that context and looking at where regulatory practice is moving in other sectors, but also overseas, the UK, the banking sector in particular being fairly instructive. Lots of discussions with ASIC, kind of talking to our colleagues. And I think where we got to was to say, well, an overarching duty has a lot of opportunity, honestly, efficiently, fairly, acting in the best interests of consumers, supported by outcomes. So I think, we just had a really great presentation from Jeannie to look at the different elements of that. But, contracts, access to dispute resolution, access to energy. I mean, you can describe some outcomes fairly readily. You can debate which ones they might be. But if they apply to that to everyone, and then as we grow and the industry changes, start to strip away some of that prescription. But I think if we try and build a whole new regulatory framework that works for new providers, existing providers, without any prescription, will be 10 to 15 years away if you think about how long it took to do the NECF in the first place. So start with the change to the law for the sale of energy, start with an overarching duty, start with some outcomes, and then look at removing that prescription as we grow and develop.
Yeah, that's really helpful. I guess one of the observations, if I can make, coming into this sector, from finance, where under, as everybody here would know, under Section 912A of the Corps Act, there's an obligation on banks to operate, honestly, efficiently and fairly. And people used to say, what does fairness mean? fairness means something different for you than it does for me. But actually, there's some very, very, very careful jurisprudence and rules around this, and it worked to the degree that banks were pretty much hollowed out following the Royal Commission and had to re-establish themselves with this sort of consumer duty in mind. I might jump to Jeannie on one point there, and that is that we've seen this shift in international jurisdictions and in certain Australian sectors, and you mentioned a bunch of them in your presentation there, Jeannie. What has been the result of that? What benefits have arisen for the sectors and for the regulators and the community more broadly from adopting this sort of newer regulatory philosophy?
Well, the philosophy, the actual idea of a consumer duty, a proactive duty, is actually still quite new, to be honest. We're probably all familiar with those negative prohibitions, don't mislead people. But this idea of prescriptive, positive outcome-based duties is relatively new, but it comes after things like the Banking and Finance Royal Commission, where we saw that there was a great deal of uncertainty about what the negative prohibitions meant and whether they really applied. And equally in the UK, they had a scandal with add-on insurance, which is where banking customers were sold with banking products, pretty much worthless insurance, like income protection insurance for people who were unemployed. So it's this kind of scandal of maybe we've forgotten about looking what the outcomes are. Miles and miles of rules isn't preventing conduct which on any metric is inappropriate. Selling someone who doesn't have a job income protection that can only be claimed by someone with a job is just not fair. So hence this idea of proactive prescriptive duties. In financial services in the UK, they've had it for a couple of years, seems to be a fair amount of support. Certainly the banking sector's getting behind that. But the understanding is that some of the quid pro quo for being subject to these obligations is the idea that some of the red tape, some of the prescription is removed, and that banks have more discretion in measuring and in identifying and measuring outcomes. Well, and the proof of it, I'll just say one more thing, we're also using it for digital platforms, which is kind of interesting. I think that we've gone only way to manage that field as well.
That's helpful, and I think it's perhaps an obvious time to move on to Mark and ask, what's the industry view of a shift like this from this more prescriptive regime to a more outcomes-based regime, and then in particular a consumer duty attaching to it?
Look, the industry is still digesting it, I think it's fair to say. From an Energy Australia perspective, when we look at it, we're interested in it from two perspectives. And the first is from the customer perspective. The direction of travel in energy over the past couple of decades has been more and more information to customers and sense of engage more and you'll get more. And that's got limits. And now, in a number of the forums I go to, people will raise things like the cognitive effort determines who is a winner and a loser in the energy market. And that's just because, okay, I have to determine if I'm importing or exporting and what all the different prices are going to be and think about all this stuff, and it's really complicated when it used to be really easy. And that just doesn't feel right from where the bulk of our customer feedback comes. Of course, there's some particularly in Queensland, some individual homeowners who want to be energy traders and they want the wholesale market there for everyone, and great, they can always do that. But for most customers, they don't have the cognitive effort or time to engage, and just giving them more push to engage and inform doesn't actually get better outcomes. So I think there's a good argument from a customer perspective that let's look at a different model. And then from the retailer perspective, we have thousands of obligations. And we compare the concept of a consumer duty with the current model. And there are attractive things about the consumer duty. We can focus on what the outcomes are that we want. The current model, the intent is all of those prescriptions deliver outcomes that governments and regulators have specified. But what they do, and Claire mentioned it's the new entrants you don't want to hamstring. I'd say it's the incumbents just as much as the new entrants. We have thousands of obligations. And so in order to prove that we're meeting all those obligations, we have to measure them, we have to put in place compliance systems to demonstrate that we have a control to prove that the thing that we're meant to do is actually happening. And then we have to have two layers of checks, one internal and then an internal audit that comes along periodically to check all that works. So that is not to test the outcome for the customer, that's to just sort of prove that the process is really robust. And at times when you get changes in the industry where you might just be raising the cognitive load on a customer, you might be doing it fully compliantly, but the outcome they're getting is worse, but sort of almost propagated because we've got to spend so much time there rather than focusing on the outcome and working backwards.
Yeah. It's interesting you say that, Mark. One thing that we see all the time is just the focus on consumer exertion as the sort of the instigator of better customer outcomes. And I guess what we're talking about here is maybe recognising that providers have got a significant role to play in designing the right kind of customer outcomes that they want for their businesses and their customers. So very helpful. And Janine, you're very much on the cutting edge of this. I note for E1, which is New South Wales Dispute Resolution for Energy and Water, you received, tell me if I'm wrong, I think it was 28,000 complaints last financial year, which is 57% increase, staggering numbers in the context of cost of living crisis and all the rest of it. How do you think that this shift from, if you like, reliability exclusively on a responsible consumer, moving more to a responsible provider, how would that play out in your world?
Well, the whole ideal of an ombudsman scheme is to resolve complaints, feed information back to industry, therefore they solve the issues and the ombudsman's out of business. The fact I'm here, I guess, means that's not quite happening. So the big increase in complaints came off, as we know, cost of living crisis, high energy prices, and it was an increase since COVID when, because the AER put in the statement of expectations, no disconnection, debt collection or credit reporting, complaints went down for my office to about 16,000, and now we've seen the normality in a cost of living environment. Whether it's, and I've checked with AFCA about, fairness in that sector, whether it's telecommunications industry ombudsman or the energy ombudsman, we always look to resolve complaints on a fair and reasonable basis, having regard to good industry practice, laws, codes and regulations and the individual circumstances of the complaint. So we have that fairness lens and we engage with the members of the scheme to be able to achieve that. And if we can identify systemic issues, get that addressed across the system for that network or retailer, whatever it might be. I guess for me, the consumer duty needs to be put in place right across the energy sector. It's just not retailers, it's just not networks, it's just not transmission companies. If we're going to get trust in transition, then we've got to make sure that solar farms, all the developers out there, all the builders out there of the new system, all the engagement with communities and the community benefits programs, all of these have to be delivered under a consumer benefits rather than consumer harm or consumer duty. So we've really got to get this right to get the benefits and to get ahead.
Yeah.
So as we heard from our previous keynote speaker.
Yeah, indeed. And talking about benefits, there are a lot of things that are claimed for a consumer duty. And we've heard a couple of them here today, more forward-looking rather than sort of retrospective, more adaptable, lower cost to serve in some ways. A whole variety of these which seem quite compelling, but there's also the literature speaks to some challenges and some potential problems, and one of those is sort of imprecision and how, if I'm a provider, how do I determine what a good customer outcome looks like, and is it different in my world in this part of my patch to another part or another? I'm interested, Claire, in your thinking on this, because you had to turn your mind to this, of course. What would the AER's, if this went ahead, what would the AER's role or response be to addressing that potential for abstraction or imprecision?
I mean, I referred to my initial hesitance and reticence in this space, and it was probably driven by trying to think about the compliance and enforcement side of it and thinking, how would we do our job? And I've been a retailer with Mark actually. How would a retailer comply? What does it look like? What sort of variations might you see between providers? And I think that is definitely something that we would need to think carefully about. And how much do retailers then need to provide compliance plans, for example, to us that then sort of locks in prescription, or how much are we then writing prescription into guidelines? And I think the whole purpose of this is to try and not do that. And so thinking through that right balance is the trickiest bit of this, I think. And I'm not sure I have the answer to that yet. I think that's something that if we do move forward with this, or if government's prepared to move forward with this, that will need very careful consideration to get that balance right. And it's partly why I guess there's a little bit of nervousness about stripping away the prescription from day one, because I think there would need to be also an established understanding legally around what the words mean in an energy context, and that will come about obviously as we develop the framework as well.
Yeah, indeed. And just to that point, I guess, there would have to be a very considerable community discussion, I guess, about what you would want to retain within a certain prescriptive sort of black and white context, because clearly there are lots of things where you'd want real obvious definition and clarity, but others where you were prepared to be more open in terms of your definitional constructs and so on.
And a lot of people in the room know we've been doing work on a payment difficulty framework review as well, and in that context, we've been looking at the various payment difficulty provisions under the law, and one of the things that I think is problematic, and we're putting out a paper on this very soon, like next couple of weeks, so I'll probably not telling any stories out of school, but you've got provisions that talk about access to payment plans for customers who are experiencing payment difficulty, and then there are separate provisions around hardship, and how retailers make that decision between those various kind of almost access routes is not always clear to us, and there are different levels of protection that apply depending on how you're identified, etc. And so, when we look at the outcomes the system's delivering, there are still 20% of customers with 90-day debt who are not receiving any support from their retailers. So is that the outcome we want? Because this sort of set of rules that's very prescriptive is certainly not delivering that.
Yeah, indeed. I guess, Mark, maybe from an industry and a retailer point of view, my personal frame of reference, as I've mentioned, is when this was sort of introduced with the penalty regime and responsible managers and designer distribution in banking, and it was an enormously challenging time, and many of you here were in that sector or know very much about it, and there was a lot of resistance from within industry, although that I think has turned around pretty comprehensively now. One of the things that was a real challenge for the sector is that there had always been a focus on the point of sale as the fundamental obligation when it came to product distribution, right? But under an outcomes regime, you're going to have to focus all the way from design of the product and target market through ensuring that the right kind of comprehensive and communication to consumers is reasonable, distributed, understood, through sales, into post-sales review. Make sure that you've got a real picture of how the product is operating through the life cycle of the customer. That way you can be reassured, I guess, through that you've got the consumer outcomes in mind and able to prove it through metrics and so on. That's a big investment. But would I be right that you're doing a lot of that work anyway, but it's not captured in the regulatory regime, or would there be more work, do you think, that you'd need to do?
You'd have to start with what does good mean in the eyes of the consumer as seen by the regulator as well. We do a lot of work thinking about what are the best things we do to give the best possible energy outcomes to our customers. One of the things we find interesting in watching the banking sector and talking to them is that when the duty came in and after the Royal Commission, one of the things that they did was they thought a lot about who their customers were, and they said, we're never going to be in an environment where we're going to be in a Royal Commission again, and it looked like they stopped extending credit to some segments who might have had higher credit risk. And when you look at their bad debts and things like that, it does look like there's a shadow banking sector that's now arisen to get the customers that used to go to the banks.
It's called Afterpay, actually.
It's maybe not that shadow. But when I look at it and say, well, is that what you wanted from the regime? I don't think that's what you wanted. You still want people to have access to banking. So that's something I'd look at very carefully from the energy perspective and say, well, what if I have to demonstrate that this was a good energy outcome for a customer, I'd hate to be in an environment where I didn't want some customers because I wasn't able to demonstrate that it was a good energy outcome. And this can get really complicated really fast. So we were talking, Brendan, before about EVs. And so there's a general story out there around around electrification electrification will probably be cheaper because the EV will be cheaper than petrol. Well, let's say that the federal government decides to put on an excise tax replacement onto EV, which changes that dynamic, and we think it's prospective to come. If someone rings us up and says, well, I'm thinking of doing this thing and I just want to confirm my energy price and I'd like to know what it is in the next couple of years, which we can't tell them because it just doesn't work like that. What's a good outcome there? And that's the sort of conversation we have to work through. And do we say nothing? What's a good outcome there?
Yeah.
So these cases where we can see the issues, we'll have a house view, but is it a good outcome that we share our house view?
Yeah.
I think that's the hardest piece that we'd have to work through that we don't do now. And we don't do it because we don't. That's not the way the system works. But arguably, we'd all be better off having more of that shared.
Indeed. Well, that's helpful. I don't think anybody here underestimates the level of challenge and complexity and the amount of time it would take to introduce this. But there's a really enticing proposition here, we think. Now, we've got some questions from the audience, and I've still got a couple here, so we'll mix them up. But I'm just reminding everybody to please jump in, add your questions, boost the ones that are there if you wish. The one that's the top of the pops here at the moment, I might actually direct to Jeannie if I can. When we've seen a consumer duty introduced, what's made it effective? Particularly in those early stages, what are the steps that we and others could take to really make this as fluid a transition as possible, presuming it gets up?
Well, I think we've heard some of the answer, which is actually to start small. We can't reform the whole regime in one go. And we certainly can't get rid of what we've got until we've established what's coming. But the overall aim is to have a well-designed system with aspirations to outcomes up here, but plenty of guidance underneath. And I'll keep emphasising it, performance metrics, which in some way answer that question about what's good. Well, let's put in place some performance metrics on how that means. But I think the lesson from the UK and also from Australia with efficient, honest and fair is to start small. Let's think about how we can improve communication, or let's think how we can improve complaints, or let's think how we can improve that tricky question of customers who have unique needs or the vulnerability, people who are experiencing vulnerability, but start small, start sector by sector.
Yeah.
Make good use of sandboxes. Sandboxes are the idea that's very popular in Australia and the UK. Sounds great, but sandboxes are this idea is that we provide a safe regulatory space for businesses to experiment, to work out what works without fear of being prosecuted by a regulator. So that's really
helpful.
answer.
That's helpful. And, not necessarily asking you to comment, but if I were a betting man, I'd suggest that the AER's sort of focus on the payment difficulty framework and that kind of work is maybe a toe in the water here.
So I just going to say, the question was also about what makes it work in other jurisdictions. And the one thing I do want to just capture, and I think, Brendan, you would speak to this, is civil penalty provisions. So when you think about the banking sector's adoption of this, it didn't really take effect until there were penalties attached to it. So
Good point.
you can't sort of have it just as a warm and fuzzy, like it actually needs to be there. And Mark, we know each other well enough. You can abstract out to the kind of conversations about, well, what would we do if someone wants to buy an EV, et cetera, et cetera. Like the ACCC data suggests that only 19% of customers are on their retailer's best plan. So, I mean, that's a much more sort of pertinent and pressing conversation that, customers might rightly ask, if you have my best interests at heart, why am I not on your best plan? And I don't know how you would think about that in that context with a duty. That's the sorts of things I think we can see today that might be improved with.
There are work that can be done, and to your point, with this element in the Corporations Act operating honestly, efficiently, and fairly has been in place for some time. But as you say, it was in 2019 when there were some very sharp penalties introduced that sort of the world changed. Hip pocket nerves are a great regulatory tool, it seems to me.
And it's interesting, actually. I think that's entirely right. So one of the things we're seeing also with social media is the introduction of penalties, civil pecuniary penalties, that would accompany both responses to scams and also this idea of keeping people safe online.
Yeah.
So it is a really good point. But
again, penalties... Oh, sorry.
No, I was just saying penalties are good, but you've got to know what you're penalising.
Yeah, and indeed it has... let me say in the banking world, of course, there was a flurry early on, but a penalty is not something that you ever want to have to exact. It is there to provide indications of seriousness as much as anything.
But that's why there needs to be I can actually see quite a few questions coming up about concerns about low socioeconomic groups, vulnerable consumers and the like, which is a huge issue, particularly for something so essential as energy. But I think what this goes to is that if we're going to think about consumer duties and what good outcomes are, it's really important that consumers have a voice on that table as well.
And that's why, perhaps Janine,
I just wanted to talk to the implementation element a bit too, because I've not met with anyone in Mark's position that doesn't have and doesn't say that we want our customers to have the best outcomes. But I think in implementation, there's got to be recognition that from your executive, your senior, your ELT, down to your front line, you've got middle and operational management with budget centre controls that put KPIs in that actually are at odds with delivering what you aim and put your customer first. So I think it really has to be, like affordability programs, there will have to be some, what are our commitments? And the simpler they can be so that they can be measured so that we can actually, take into account those against complaints. But really so that every level of your business understands what Energy Australia or whatever retailer or network or transmission company, what it is that you want to achieve for your customers from a consumer duty perspective.
I might jump in on a couple of ones there. Absolutely, it's up to us to work out how to cascade our intention down through the organisation and make sure our intention matches the lived experience. And there's different ways we do that. One way we do that is by stating what our intention is. So we have a hardship policy. We've got an energy assist program, and that's there to help people who are going through experiencing financial hardship. And we articulate that, we put in place training regimes, we then cross-check that that's actually happening. I go down, I went with one of Claire's colleagues recently and we just listened to calls just to, as an additional validation to make sure that it's working. And that leadership visibility matched with all the controls is the way that you get that uniform experience across the organisation, and I'm very confident that that sort of program works really well for us. The question of pricing and why people aren't on the lowest price. Again, this is a prescription territory. Everyone we put on a product, it needs to give explicit and informed consent to move to that product. So if they want to be on the cheapest product, they have to give us the consent to do it. We can't just move them. And on every bill, we have a best offer on bills so they can see how much money they might save if they were on a different product. They get regular price change notifications, and they don't all shift. It just doesn't happen. So then that's one of the features of the system. If we did have a different system where there was a consumer duty around pricing, a consumer duty, we'd have to think about how pricing worked. Absolutely.
Yeah. I think that's... sorry, Mike.
Yeah, and if I can there's one question here around what good looks like to the consumer. And from the research we do, we talk to customers every day. So we've got... And we get a lot of feedback from that. And our latest research is 74% of customers think good looks like affordability and pricing. And what does that mean? It means energy bills go up at less than inflation each year and they're predictable. That's what it means. And Gavin's laughing because he can see that predictable, and we've spoken a bit about this. They would like to know what the dollar per month cost of the energy will be, and then for it to match what they actually get in advance. And that's not the way the system works at the moment. Now, even if we have a consumer duty there in place, we're not going to be able to do that without some pretty serious work on the policy framework before that. But that's what good looks like. It's predictable and affordable in the sense that it becomes more affordable over time, so it doesn't go up at a higher cost than inflation. We won't get there automatically with a consumer duty.
No,
it's probably
I think
the
that's
easy
fair.
point you made before as well about the cognitive load, and customers probably want it to be easy, I think, too.
Yeah, I mean, if I can say
want that too.
on the cognitive load question, and first of all, obviously consumer duty is one brick in a wall. There's a lot of work being done. The AMC's pricing review at the moment will address, we're hoping, some of the questions that you raised there. And when I look at that cognitive load question, I'm always reminded of our survey results, and I'm looking at Ash, who's done all this work for it. Tell me if I'm wrong here, but the numbers I recall, 19% of consumers know what a retail tariff is. 18% of consumers know what their own tariff is, with any confidence. Now, if I look at any other essential services sector, and I said 4 out of 5 people don't know what their price is, how it's constructed, there'd be a bit of an uproar, I think. You know, if you had to go to the supermarket and you could only pick one price out of 5, if you went to, you know, the service station and, you know, the Bowser didn't have a price on it, there'd be an uproar. But here we kind of take it somehow as just a fact of this business that people are never really going to understand their pricing, never really going to understand their bill. I can imagine, Mark, that is an enormous challenge for you guys, and maybe this is a regime that might help that. And then I'm also keen to hear from Janine on this point. You know, how much is that comprehension burden informing complaints too?
Oh, absolutely. And our customers want to know what their actions do to their energy costs. And so if they're turning something on, they want it to know about how much it's going to cost. And so the common conversations we'll have with customers who are seeking to reduce their energy bill is, well, what appliances have you got in the home? What's the heater? What's the cooler? What's the fridge? And we'll work out the dollar per day, roughly, of those. And that's a good conversation because it makes it real. It makes it understandable. And one of the interesting elements, Janine raised the consumer duty across the energy chain, things that make that unpredictable for customers. I think we'd have to really test whether they would survive this sort of regime. So, for example, demand tariffs have been featured in the media where someone uses something and all of a sudden their bill goes up by a couple of $100 because they didn't expect it to be there. Under a duty of care where there's a sort of predictable element to it, so that customers know what they're getting and can reasonably expect their actions won't have unexpected impacts. That's a good test case for, if you want to put it in place, you have to do it across all the bits that touch that so that you get the consumer outcome we're after.
Yeah, indeed, it's kind of a test in a way, isn't it, of the viability of a product from a consumer point of view. Yeah, that makes lots of sense. Janine?
I think if people understood their energy bills, our complaints would halve overnight. We had 2 Bring Your Bills days, one in Nowra, one in South Wollongong just 2 weeks ago. What brings people to us is that they don't understand their bill even, and I know that the AER with the better billing guideline, we've come a long way, but it's still such a challenge. It's an essential service though, and people don't necessarily want to know about tariffs and which one they're on. They want to know that they can afford their bill. And whatever the price, as we heard from our keynote speaker this morning, if you go out to Wilcannia, out to Detton, out to Dubbo, out to any of the First Nations communities, when quality of housing is so poor, when energy efficiency, even if there's solar that's been put on the roof, a smart meter and maybe a reverse cycle air conditioner heater, but there's still broken windows or there's still drafts, you know, it's an upgrade that actually is not delivering on it. The heat in winter out there, the cold, the heat in summer, the cold in winter, means that an average a quarterly bill is like $1,500 at whatever price they're paying. That's, you know, that's something that we have to address separately to the overall what the energy price is. We've got to recognise that we've got to be equitable. And, you know, when we've got to provide equal access to energy at an affordable price, but that affordable price has to be variable.
Yeah, and of course a consumer duty is not going to address any number of those things. They're system questions, I guess, and social questions. You talked about community equity, and one of the questions here interested me, and perhaps Gina, I can ask you. You know, is it reasonable to expect that a retailer, for instance, is going to be in a position to refract a consumer duty based on demographics, for example? We've been asked here about ethnicities and socioeconomic groups and impacts on First Nations community. We're still in an environment, as you know, Kerry and Carol and others will tell you, where we have communities in the centre off power as often as they're on power. Is it reasonable to expect that under a duty, a retailer will be able to understand that level of detail about a consumer to make sure that the outcome matches that consumer, or do they have to step back and do it at a more general level?
They absolutely have to do it at that specific level. What I should say, I think the question of vulnerability comes up a lot, or simply exclusion from reasonable, secure, well-priced energy, is that all of the consumer duties example I gave actually have carve-outs for consumers experiencing vulnerability, where there are in fact some quite prescriptive rules about continuing to serve that consumer base, and also almost taking more responsibility. So consumer duty doesn't work by saying, well, you've got to know your target market and therefore don't serve a group of that market. It's know your target market, make sure the product is suitable for them. Maybe products should be less complicated, but also that markets we know are particularly vulnerable need extra efforts and in fact have extra protections that are locked in.
Catered for. Well, the number one question that we have here on the list at the moment, maybe Claire, I can ask you if you wouldn't mind. How does what we're talking about here differ really from just taking care of customers? What are the degrees of difference, if there are some?
Look, I think we're talking about something that's a little bit more specific than that, I would say. And I think, I've been reflecting a lot on the conversation, and I don't think we should pretend it's easy. And I think many of the comments that Mark's made and Jeannie and Janine are all things that will need to be worked through. Yeah. But an overarching duty still does specify, puts it obligation. So it's not just take care. It's an obligation to act in the best interests of the consumer and to act, honestly, efficiently, fairly, if that's the language that's adopted. So it is more specific, I think, than just taking care. And there is legal precedent around many of those words. And so I think it has some greater specificity than people might at first glance appreciate. I would say, though, in the hardship, and you and I were talking about this before, the hardship provisions were intended to sort of go down a little bit down this path in the sense that it created an obligation on a retailer to have a hardship policy, and then we approve effectively that policy. And we see quite a lot of variation in what's within those policies and how they're implemented, and even to the point of, do customers who might have left left and gone to another retailer but have a debt with you, are they still owed something? We see quite a bit of difference between retailers, and we struggle with this too. How much should we be, the temptation is to get more and more specific around what you require because you're not seeing what you hope to see, I guess. And, you made the point about you have it on your bills. It's only on the bills because it's required. No retailer was putting onto their bill, you can be on a better offer until it was in the Better Bills guideline or the Victorian equivalent. And so, I don't know, it's just chicken and egg, right? And I'm thrilled that you would put customers on the best plan if it wasn't for EIC. I think we can work on that somehow.
Yeah, I must admit, I think I wrote that one down myself. No, that's very helpful. Tell you what, we've got only a few minutes left, so I'm going to ask Claire one more quick question just about, where to from here. And then I'd like to ask each of the four of you 30 seconds to tell us something that you maybe that I haven't asked you, or that you're really keen to say, and maybe as a takeaway message for the people in the room, many of whom are probably going to go and we would hope learn a little bit more about what a consumer duty might mean for them and for their constituency, and perhaps be advocates for it if they decide it's something of value. So what are the steps from here, Claire? What's where are we in introducing such a thing?
So, as you said, we put a report to ministers at the end of 2023. Last year, we did take the Energy Advisory Panel and various governments through the thinking on the duty. We didn't actually land in 2023 on a duty, but we've done further work on that since then. We've done the Payment Difficulty Frameworks Review. I think that everyone's probably seen the ministers' communique from the Energy and Climate Change Ministerial Council in December last year, which acknowledged it was taking forward that work. So there's a further paper going to energy ministers actually in March between ourselves and the federal department to push this along. So it's happening. Obviously, there's many things that could happen between here and
there's one or two things going on, I'm told.
The next Energy Ministers meeting, but we are on that journey with the federal government and all jurisdictions at looking at how this could be implemented.
And I should say ECA is with you in every step of that journey. So thank you very much, Claire. Mark, maybe from you, is there anything that we haven't covered that you'd like to mention?
Just Claire mentioned that start piecewise, start somewhere, and I'd suggest the best place to start is somewhere where the, say, retailers have the most prospect to do something quicker. And I think financial vulnerability is a good place to start with those hardship policies because they make a difference quite quickly. And it is an area where you think a lot about, well, what's the best approach we do? And so for us, we have a knock to stay connected program, and we're one of the few who have that. We do it through the Energy Charter, and that's an example where we've thought about, well, what's actually the right answer here? And so we send someone out to check, is someone in this house and who are they and why haven't they spoken to us?
Yeah.
And just exploring all the different ways people go about that might be somewhere where you get impact and can prove it works, or what the issues are at least.
Yeah, really helpful. Thank you, Mark. Very, very interested in that. Janine, maybe.
The energy sector has a strong, positive, and dare I say it, trusted reputation and culture for safety, for physical safety. Now, there's a lot of regulation around safety. Why can't we leverage that to the things that can come and cause consumer harm from a mental health and disconnection, debt, all of those things can have other health impacts on consumers. So let's use what we know to apply that through a lens of consumer duty.
Yeah, it's interesting. A number of jurisdictions where consumer duty has been introduced have contemplated this in terms of consumer safety. They've got operational safety well twigged in their brain. By introducing consumer safety, it's actually fed into a pre-existing culture within the organisation. Very helpful, thank you. And Jeannie, maybe a final word from you.
Okay, so I'm going to be the lecturer now and say, if you have
20 seconds.
questions, come and ask me. But I think about it this way. We have a floor. It's not a free-for-all. There's a floor. We have a duty of care, protect people from harm. We have a positive duty to promote good outcomes. So the floor, and then we raise it.
Okay, lovely. Raising the roof, we like that idea. Thank you very much. Please congratulate and thank our guests for it. Thank you.